Hi everyone, I'm Connor with the All Campus Makerspace, and today we're going to be showing you how to build a computer. The components we'll be using today are the Intel i7-8700K for our processor and the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2080 Ventus OC edition from MSI. Before you go ahead and put all these into your case here, you're going to want to test out some of the main components on the motherboard. We're going to start by first opening up the CPU socket on our motherboard. To do that, we're going to pull out on the retention arm and lift it out from underneath the retaining clip here. And we're going to lift up on it, and you'll notice that the actual cover slides back and then it'll flip up. Now, in order to actually place the CPU inside, we're going to look at either the socket itself, or on my motherboard here, it's this little dot here on the corner. Now that is going to correspond to our CPU. The CPU has a little triangle in one of the corners, and that tells you where to line it up with that dot. This is also a little easier on Intel motherboards because Intel CPUs have these little notches up in the sides here that correspond with spots in the socket. Now you'll notice I'm handling the CPU from the edges and the corners so as not to touch these contacts on the bottom. If you touch these contacts, it can actually corrode them from the oils on your fingers and can actually ruin your processor. So to place the CPU in, we are going to line up our triangle with the circle and then gently place it in, giving it a little wiggle to make sure it's in the right spot. And then we are going to pull down on our cover, make sure it gets underneath the little retaining screw there. And then as you pull back down the arm, you'll notice the little black cover pop off. And now you've installed your CPU. It's very important to hang on to this cover in case your motherboard has any problems with it. They may ask you to put this back on when you send it to the manufacturer. The next important component we're going to put onto our motherboard for our test is RAM. Now, I have 2 sticks of this Vengeance RGB RAM. And in order to make full use of those 2 sticks, we're going to want to run it in dual channel mode. In order to do that, we need to put the sticks into certain slots on our motherboard here. So on this motherboard, as with most of them, you start at the furthest most slot from the CPU. This can all be found in the user manual for the motherboard as well. And then you want to skip over one slot and place it in the next slot so that they're staggered. With RAM, you'll notice that it has a notch along the bottom there that corresponds to this piece of blocking in the slot so that you can't put it in the wrong way. So now you'll want to line up your RAM and make sure that you've pulled the tab open so you can slot it in. And just push down until you hear it click and click. And then you do that again with the other piece. And there, now your RAM's installed. Now, before we can test boot this, we need some way to cool our CPU. I'm doing this using a Corsair H150i all-in-one liquid cooler. It has 3 120mm fans. You could use something much simpler, but this is what's going to be going in the final system. So I'm going to go ahead and use this. In order to mount that, we first need to attach the mounting posts to the motherboard. The posts look like this. Usually there's a full bracket that goes on the back, but on some motherboards it interferes with pins, and you can actually still make do with just the little parts that it screws into. So we're going to go ahead and mount these. So now your mounting posts are in place. But before you can mount the cooler to these mounting posts, you need to make sure that there's thermal paste applied. Oftentimes this will come pre-applied on a new cooler, but if it doesn't, very simple to apply. Thermal paste often will come in little tubes that look like these little syringes here. And what you're going to do is you're going to take your tube and put about a grain of rice sized blob right on the center of the processor here. Now you're good to go ahead and mount your processor, or mount your cooler. With the cooler in place, you can go ahead and screw on the retaining knob. And when you do this, you want to make sure to do it in a crisscross pattern so that the thermal paste gets applied evenly across the CPU. Before we can do anything with this though, we need to make sure all of these cables are plugged in the proper places. This is an external power plug for the cooler. It's provided through the SATA power, which is found on your power supply. And this is for the pump that's inside the cooler here. I like to route these around so that there's not a lot of cables in the way. And there's actually a plug on this motherboard specifically for all-in-one liquid cooler pumps. And then we plug the SATA power cable for our cooler into our power supply. Now, in order to do our test, we have to plug in our CPU power up here in the corner. And lastly, we need to plug in the power for our motherboard, which is over here on the edge of our motherboard. It's a 24-pin connector. Okay. And now the power for all of our motherboard components are attached. Now, before we continue further, we want to install our graphics card. So our graphics card uses what's called a PCI Express slot. That's this connector here. And that matches up with these three longer connectors on this motherboard. There is an older version of PCI Express, and it's PCI, and it looks very similar, but you actually cannot plug PCI into PCI Express and PCI Express into PCI. Now we're going to use this top slot because it actually provides the most data transfer compared to these other slots. So in order to install our card, we're going to push down on the clip and then line up our connector with the slot. And then you just push down until you hear it click. It may not click audibly, but you need to just make sure that the clip is fastened. Now, because this is a more powerful graphics card, not all cards need this, but this needs external power, meaning that we need to run one of these cables from our power supply. And these just plug in to the back of the card here. Now, you might be wondering, how do you turn on the system without an actual power switch? So, there's actually two pins down here in the corner that correspond to the power switch, and that's actually where you're going to plug the power switch into later when we put it into the case. But since there's no power switch plugged into it now, you can actually take any screwdriver and touch the two contacts together. And the system will turn on. Then we turn our attention to the monitor, and you can see that we've now booted. This screen here shows us that all 16 gigabytes of our memory is there, and our 8700K is installed properly. Now we can go ahead and shut down the system using the power supply switch. The case we're building in today is the Lee & PC011 Dynamic. Now we're going to start by taking all of the top and side panels off so that we can get access to the inside. Now these are glass panels, so you're going to want to put these someplace safe where they won't get scratched or broken. So we're going to start by placing our I/O shield into our case. You'll see there's a slot here in the case for it. So all you got to do is make sure it's facing the correct direction. So on this one, this side is up. And then you just line it up until it snaps into place. Sometimes it does take a little bit of force to get it to snap into place, but it should go in fairly easily. Now that we have the I/O shield in, we can go ahead and place our motherboard in the case. And you'll notice that there are actually a bunch of small little posts. They're called standoffs inside the case. That's where you're going to screw the mounting screws into after the case or the motherboard is in place. Now we can go ahead and screw in all of our motherboard mounting screws. Now that our motherboard's all set, we want to go ahead and make sure our radiator is properly mounted. As you can see, I've already mounted the fans to the radiator, but the radiator itself has to get mounted to the case. So if we spin this around, we'll notice that in the case, there's a whole bunch of these holes along the radiator. Now, we're going to take our radiator mounting screws that came with it, and we're going to line these up with the mounting holes on the radiator. If you were using an air cooler instead of a liquid cooler, this step wouldn't exactly be necessary, but you may want to mount just fans in this place. And one important note is that these radiators come with two sizes of screws, one that's really long and one size that's really long and one that are really short. When you're mounting just the radiator, you want to use the short screws because there's actually tubes in here that move the water through the radiator. And if you have too long of a screw, you can puncture that. Now that we have our motherboard in place, we're going to go ahead and install our SSD that gets mounted to the motherboard. It's called an NVMe SSD, and it actually goes underneath this plate right here. Now that we have the cover off, we can go ahead and mount our NVMe SSD. So to do that, you line up the slot on the motherboard with the SSD. You're going to push the SSD flat and then mount a screw on top of it to secure it in place. Now that that's done, you can go ahead and put your your cover back on. A lot of these actually have a thermal pad on the inside to help dissipate the heat. This may have a sticker on it, so all you want to do is you want to peel that sticker off so it doesn't melt. Next, we're going to go ahead and install our other forms of storage, such as our SSDs and our hard drive. We're going to have 2 SSDs located in the front in these 2 trays, and then one hard drive in the back in the hard drive tray. We're going to go ahead and unscrew the SSD trays from the chassis and pull them out. So we're going to line up the connectors on the side that we want and just slide it in. You'll notice the holes line up really well with the tray. And we're going to go ahead and screw those in. Now that our SSDs are in their trays, we can go ahead and just slide these back in. And very similarly, we are going to line up the hard drive on the tray. And you'll notice that the holes line up. Now that we have our drive securely mounted to our drive tray, we're going to go ahead and put this back in our case here. Just slides right in and locks into place. Now, at this point in time, we're going to want to plug in all of our data cables, including USB, front panel audio, the power button, and all those types of things before it gets too cluttered with all the power cables. So this is a USB 3.0 connector, and I'm going to be plugging it into this connector over here instead of this one, but notice that I had to remove one of the fans here to get it plugged in, but I'm going to put it back in after. So let me show you. Each of these connectors has a little notch on it that shows you which way it goes, and this is just going to make it so we can use the USB ports on the front of the case here. So it clicks right in, and then we can go ahead and we can mount our fan back on here. The next set of cables we want to take care of are the front panel connectors, so like your power button and the LEDs associated with it and stuff like that. So it usually looks like a bunch of small little connectors like this, and we're going to take it and we're going to just run it down through this bottom hole here. Additionally, we have our audio connector, which needs to get run over here through this connector because it's in that corner of the motherboard. So here's the audio cable we ran through, and you'll notice that it has a specific pin missing from the connector, and that corresponds to a missing pin on this connector down here. So we just go ahead and we pop that on. And then we also have all of our front panel connectors here. Now, sometimes these are labeled on the motherboard, sometimes not. You may have to check your motherboard's manual for this. And now we have those all connected. The next cables that we're going to use are our SATA data cables. Now, you'll notice this block of connectors right here. These are your SATA data connectors, and they correspond to these connectors here. So, in order to use these, we're going to just pick a couple of them. Doesn't really matter which ones. And we're going to run the cable through and plug it in until when it clicks. And since we have 3 drives that connect with SATA, we're going to run 3 cables. Now we want to go ahead and run these cables to our different drives from the back of the case here. So one of them we're going to run to this hard drive here. One of them is going to get run down through this hole to the SSD that's there. And then the other one is going to go through this hole. We can grab our cables here. You may need to pull the SSDs out in order to get to the cables. Lastly, before we start running power cables, we're going to want to hook up all of our fans. So we have 3 fan connectors for our water cooler, and it just plugs into these 3 little connectors that are attached to the water cooler itself. For this, we're using these Insignia case fans. So you want to run your fan power through this little hole at the top there. And then there are notches on the top of the case that you line them up with. Now that we've got our fans mounted, we want to make sure to plug those fans in. Now that we have most of our data cables all set, we want to go ahead and run or put in our power supply. When you're putting in a power supply, you want to make sure it's going to be getting fresh air to the fan. And to do that, they often will have a cutout in the case for that. On this case, it's actually on the side panel right here. So we're going to go ahead and mount our power supply just like that. Now we can start running the cables for our power supply. Now we're going to go ahead and plug in the main motherboard power cable, and this gets run through here. You'll see that this comes through and it plugs in right here. After that, we can go ahead and plug in our CPU power, and this, when you can get it around to the other side, comes through and just plugs in right up here. Now, before you close this all up, you want to always clean up the cables a little bit. Lastly, we're gonna go ahead and install our graphics card. To do that, we first have to take out these covers. And now we just go ahead and, just like we did before, just slide this right in. Make sure that latch closes. And now we just make sure to remount these screws and plug in your power cables. Now that we got the system all together, we can check to make sure that works. And it does. And now that we know that the system runs, we can go ahead and put all of our side panels back on. Thank you all for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.